Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association webinar entitled How to Get Licensed as a Mental Health Counselor in Florida. My name is Aaron Norton, and I'm the president-elect of the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association and also the chair of FMCA's Education and Training Standards and Continuing Education Committee. And I'm also your Southern Regional Director for the American Mental Health Counselors Association. We'll go ahead and launch our first polling question. Which of the following describes you? And you can select all of them that apply if more than one applies. Your options are licensed mental health professional, a registered intern, a counseling student, a counselor educator, or other. So 64% of you are students, which kind of makes sense given the topic for today's webinar, but also 9% of you are licensed, 9% are interns, 9% are counselor educators, and 9% are other. I'll start by letting you know on the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see an email address that you can use to reach me. It's me@anorton.com. So if you have questions today that you didn't get answered during the webinar, feel free to send me an email to that email address, or if you have a different email address for me, they all go to the same place now. So I'll be happy to answer questions for you even after today's webinar. So what we're going to cover today is the purpose of licensure. So why do we have a license, and what is our definition of mental health counseling in Florida and our scope of practice? We're not going to spend very long on that, because then we're going to jump right into covering the 3 different paths to licensure, including licensure by examination, which is the most popular path that most of you as students are probably wanting to hear about today. But we're also going to cover licensure by endorsement and the provisional licensure that leads to a licensure by endorsement. And then we'll talk about licensure portability, including the National Counselor Licensure Endorsement Process, or NCLEP, and then what you can do to help advance licensure portability, because it'd be really nice when you get your license here in Florida for you to be able to get licensed in other states relatively easily if you end up moving. Then we'll list a few resources at the end and then handle any questions and answers that we didn't get to during the webinar. So feel free to keep those questions and comments coming in, and we'll see what we can do to address them. So now we're going to launch another polling question. There are a couple polling questions I'm going to launch just to kind of get a sense of what you already think about a few things. What makes clinical mental health counselors unique from other counselors? Clinical mental health counselors are unique from other types of counselors because they can, and here are your options: A, conduct career assessments; B, help people make important lifestyle choices; C, diagnose and treat mental disorders; D, work in private practice settings; and E, discuss medication regimen with clients. So 75% of you said that what makes us unique as clinical mental health counselors is that we diagnose and treat mental disorders. And then 17% said work in private practice, and finally 8% said discuss medication regimen. All 3 of those answers are kind of good answers, but really the best answer is C, diagnose and treat mental disorders. That's what separates us from career counselors and school counselors and rehabilitation counselors and other counselors. As far as private practice goes, the confusing part about that is there are actually some scenarios where counselors could work in a private practice. They can't be healthcare practitioners or be on insurance panels, but career counselors, for example, could open a private practice where they do career counseling only. Similarly, there are many rehabilitation counselors who have private practices where they do vocational evaluations and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of a tricky question. And then discussing medication regimen with clients, well, you could argue that clinical mental health counselors, that's more in their area of expertise, but medication's really not our scope of practice. Doesn't mean we can't discuss some things about medication, like medication compliance, for example, and that sort of thing. But that's not the best answer, I don't think, anyway. I'll share with you in Florida, according to our own statutes here in the state of Florida, what the purpose of our license is. It is to preserve, wait a second, it looks like I'm missing a slide. No? Okay, good. All right. Well, it's to preserve the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So that's primarily why the state government gets involved in our profession and provides licensure. It's to preserve health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Florida. But the aim is to encourage needed or desired counseling, clinical and psychotherapy services, or certain other services of a psychological nature to be sought out, with the hope that those services will assist the public primarily with emotional survival, which in turn affects physical and psychophysical survival. And the way that they're going to protect the public is to establish minimum qualifications for entering into and remaining in our profession. So, in other words, the purpose of licensure is about healthcare. It's because what makes clinical mental health counselors unique from other types of counselors is that we are healthcare practitioners. We can treat disorders in the healthcare arena, serve on insurance panels, and so we're a part of the healthcare workforce in our state. And the state government tends to regulate healthcare related professions with licensure and in some cases certification. So that's why we even have a license. So what are the different licensed mental health professions in generally speaking? Well, there's us, clinical mental health counselors. There are clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists, clinical social workers, marriage and family therapists, psychiatrists, and then finally psychiatric nurse practitioners. So my last polling question for you is, what do you think the largest segment of the licensed mental health behavioral workforce is composed of? The largest of the licensed mental health professions is, and your options are A, counselors, B, marriage and family therapists, C, psychiatrists, D, psychologists, or finally E, social workers. I'll give you a moment to chime in and guess which do you think is the largest sector of the behavioral health care workforce in the U.S. 53% of you said counselors, and a close second, 40% of you said social workers, and finally 7% said psychologists. So let's see what the answer to the question is. Turns out that counselors are now the largest sector of the behavioral health care workforce. So congratulations, you get to be a part of the large, booming, and expanding team of qualified mental health practitioners in the United States, with counselors comprising 37% of our behavioral health care workforce, and then social workers coming in at a close second at 29%, and then finally psychologists at 16%, and so on. So now I'm going to tell you how you can get handouts of today's slides. I didn't share them with you earlier because of the polling questions, but all you would do is use this link that you see on this screen. So it's if you just type in app.box.com/v/get licensed, you will be able to access the handouts. And I'm going to share this slide again at the end in case anybody missed it. We'll also include that link in a follow-up email for all of you who complete the evaluation form, so that in case you missed it, you'll be able to get it then as well. So what's our definition of mental health counseling here in Florida? We're defined as the use of scientific and applied behavioral science theories, methods, and techniques for the purpose of describing, preventing, and treating undesired behavior and enhancing mental health and human development. So this again sort of helps to highlight how we are healthcare practitioners in the state of Florida, and really nationwide we're healthcare practitioners, and that's why we have a license in every state now. Our scope of practice, the short version, is that we evaluate, assess, diagnose, and treat emotional and mental dysfunctions or disorders. So again, this sort of answers our questions about what makes clinical mental health counselors unique from other types of counselors, and why it is that state governments require us to be licensed as healthcare practitioners. So let's get into now our 3 different paths to licensure. There are actually 3 different ways that somebody can become licensed. In a way, you could say there are really 2 different ways, and then the third way is sort of a segue to one of those 2 ways. But the first and most common path is licensure by examination. And those of you who are students, that is probably exactly the path that you're taking, licensure by examination. But your other 2 possibilities are licensure by endorsement. And that's really a scenario where you're licensed in another state and you're trying to get your license in Florida. But if you don't meet the requirements for licensure by endorsement, there is a temporary provisional licensure that gives you a path to work towards licensure by endorsement. So we'll mostly focus on the most popular path that you're interested in, which is licensure by examination. So the first requirement is the educational requirement. You have to have at least a master's degree from a CACREP accredited mental health counseling program. That's one way to satisfy the educational requirement. So if you're attending a program that's accredited by CACREP in clinical mental health counseling, and you complete that program with a master's degree, you should be good as far as the educational requirement goes. The tough part is what happens when you come from a program that is not CACREP accredited. So for example, when I graduated in 2007 from USF's Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program, we were core accredited at the time, but we were not CACREP accredited. We now are. So I do not have a CACREP accredited master's degree, yet I'm still licensed here in Florida. So we'll talk about how that came to be. Because you can also have a master's degree from a program related to our practice that is CACREP equivalent. Now that quote is not a quote from the licensure board. It's a common term that people use to describe, though, what the licensure board talks about in terms of that other educational requirement option. So by the way, the board that manages our license is called the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling. It's a long name because that board actually manages 3 different professional identities in terms of master's level behavioral health care workers. So what most of us do is we just call it the 491 board. That's a much shorter term, and most people in the field know what it means. And it basically is a reference to Florida Statute Chapter 491, which is the chapter in our statutes that gives that board its power. So the second requirement is that you have supervised experience. This consists of 2 years of postmaster's supervised experience under the supervision of a board-approved qualified supervisor. So when you complete your master's degree, once you've graduated, you then start a minimum of 100 weeks, roughly 2 years, of work as a registered mental health counselor intern, where you're being supervised by a qualified supervisor. During that period of time, you have to participate in at least 100 hours of supervision with your qualified supervisor. You can get that done in no less than 100 weeks. So most people do an hour of supervision per week for 2 years, and then they know that they have satisfied their requirement. The second requirement for that supervised experience is that you have done 1,500 hours of face-to-face psychotherapy with clients. So I want to highlight a few things about this. If you can get done in no less than 100 weeks and you need 1,500 hours of face-to-face therapy with clients, then if you do the math, that basically means that you need to average 15 hours a week of therapy with clients. If you can do 15 hours a week on average, then you should be able to complete that requirement within 100 weeks. Some weeks you might have less than 15, but other weeks maybe you'll have more than 15, and that'll help compensate. You, at minimum, have to have an hour of supervision every 2 weeks. But remember, we just said that you need at least 100 hours of supervision. So imagine if you only did supervision once every 2 weeks, then it would actually take you 200 weeks, which would be roughly 4 years to complete your internship. So that's a minimum. No matter how few clients you see, you still need to do an hour of supervision every 2 weeks. But if you want to get done in 100 weeks and you're averaging 15 hours of therapy a week, then you really need to be doing your supervision weekly. Now, a few things about this hour of supervision every 2 weeks, or preferably every week. At least every other supervision session must be an individual supervision session, which the board defines as being 1 or 2 interns in the room with the supervisor. So you can buddy up with another intern for an hour of supervision, and that's still considered individual supervision. The second option is to do group supervision. That's defined as 3 to 6 interns in the room with the qualified supervisor. So you can never have a group of more than 6 interns. But your initial supervision session must always be in person, and that should be a one-on-one appointment. And then up to 50% of your individual supervision sessions can be done through webcam. So every other supervision session could be done through webcam if, say, you live in maybe a rural area and your supervisor is pretty far away. And it's kind of hard for you to get there on time, or it's a big ordeal to travel that distance. Then there is an option of doing at least half of your individual supervision, or doing at most half of your individual supervision sessions through webcam. You still have to go in person for the other half. Now, if you do elect group supervision, understand that group and individual supervision must alternate. I guess I forgot to put that on this slide, but that's really important. So for example, here in my practice, my interns, every other week, they see me for individual sessions, and then every other week they come to group. So it goes individual, group, and so on, all the way until they're done. You can't have 2 group supervision sessions in a row. They must alternate between group and individual. And my assumption is that the board made it that way because they wanted to make sure that you're getting good individualized attention, or at least a degree of that when you're doing your supervision. So the third requirement for licensure by examination is to pass the exam. And the exam that's currently used for this pathway is the National Clinical Mental Health Counseling Examination, or NCMHCE, which was developed by the National Board for Certified Counselors, or NBCC. So this is a national exam that many, many states use. It's probably, there are 2 popular national exams that are used from state to state. One of them is the NCMHCE, and then the other one is the NCE, which is a more general counseling exam that's created by NBCC. But I, for one, personally prefer using the NCMHCE because the NCE exam is too general. To me, it doesn't do a good enough job in making sure that you have some minimum skills and expertise and knowledge as a clinical mental health counselor versus another type of counselor. So that is my personal opinion. And that also is the prevailing belief here in Florida. And that's why we require the NCMHCE exam, though that may be changing in the future. We'll get to that later. The fourth requirement is that you complete a laws and rules course. This is an 8-hour course on the unique laws and rules that govern your profession here in the state of Florida. And it has to be by a board-approved provider listed on CE Broker, which is the electronic database of continuing education providers recognized by the 491 board. The fifth requirement is that you complete a 3-hour HIV/AIDS course from an approved provider. Now, technically, you could get licensed without completing this course, but if you do that, then you have to agree to sign an affidavit attesting that you will complete this program within 6 months of being licensed and notify the board. So what I always strongly recommend is just get it out of the way before you get licensed. Get it out of the way while you're a registered intern. Get all of these educational requirements done so that you don't have to worry about getting them done within the first 6 months of licensure. Finally, the sixth requirement for licensure by exam is to complete a 2-hour domestic violence course from an approved provider, again, within 6 months of licensure, though I recommend doing it as an intern. There are organizations that provide all 3 of these courses, the laws and rules, the HIV/AIDS, and the domestic violence course in one package. For example, the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, every year at our annual conference, which usually is in Orlando, we provide all 3 trainings in one weekend so that you can get all your requirements knocked out together. So remember I said earlier, for the educational requirement, you either have to have a CACREP-accredited degree or you have to have a CACREP equivalent degree. So what do we mean by a CACREP equivalent degree? Well, it's a master's degree from a program related to mental health counseling that consists of at least 60 semester hours. And you have to have a minimum of 3 semester hours in all of these 12 content areas. And then it lists right here under the second bullet point. Oh, where did my, I don't know where my arrow went to, but oh well, I guess we'll survive without it for a moment. The second bullet point lists all of those 12 different subject areas. The third requirement for your degree, if you do not come from a CACREP accredited program, is to have at least 1,000 hours of university-sponsored supervised clinical practicum, internship, or field experience in your degree program. So that's why you will see that you have generally practicum 1, practicum 2, and internship class in your mental health counseling programs here in Florida. Now, how do you find a qualified supervisor? Well, one way to do it is to just ask around, because you can get a lot of really good recommendations and referrals by word of mouth. Now, many of you will be doing your internship in an agency that already has qualified supervisors available to you. So that may be the most convenient and easy way to get a qualified supervisor, but there are some drawbacks to that approach. One of them is that sometimes the qualified supervisor in your agency, you may feel uncomfortable talking to them about concerns that you have about ethical and legal concerns with the agency. You may be turned off from doing that because you never know. This qualified supervisor might be an administrator in your agency. They might be somebody who might be deciding whether to promote you or not in the future. And this can create some potential for a dual relationship or a conflict of interest in the supervision process. Because ideally, you'd be able to go see an independent supervisor and talk about concerns you have about your agency without any fear of reprisal from within the agency. So that's something to consider. But it is also oftentimes a free way to get supervision. Some agencies require you to sign a contract that you'll work with them for a minimum period of time if you use a supervisor within the agency. And so that turns some people off as well, but these are some factors to consider. You may also want to check the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association's Qualified Supervisor database. So to check that resource, you would just visit fmhca.org, and then you would select Member Directory and Qualified Supervisor Directory under Membership. And then you can use the advanced search feature to find all of the qualified supervisors who are members of FONCA. And then you can read some information about them and then decide who you want to contact. Also, you may have a regional chapter. So the way that the hierarchy goes, there's the American Mental Health Counselors Association on the national level. Then there's the state association, which is a chapter of the national organization. Here in Florida, that's FOMCA, the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association. And then FOMCA has regional chapters in different areas. Like here in the Tampa Bay area, we have the Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association. But on the East Coast, there is the Palm, I think it's called Palm County Mental Health Counselors Association. I don't know, but each region has its own association, and your region may have a local listing of qualified supervisors, just like ours here in the Tampa Bay area does with the Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association. Oh, look at that, my arrow's back. Then you can also research potential supervisors online and schedule an interview, because remember, you really want somebody who you think has what you're looking for as a supervisor. So don't just feel like you have to go with the first supervisor that you see. Interview them, research them, learn about their approach and their specialties, and then decide if you think they're the right person for you. Now, no matter who you choose, always go yourself to this website and verify whether or not they really are a qualified supervisor, because some people don't realize that there now are renewal requirements to stay a qualified supervisor. And some people might think they're a qualified supervisor, but they're not. And if you end up in a scenario like that, sadly, you will do 2 years of supervision and get no credit for it. So the way to do that is, I'll show you. I'll click on this link here. We'll go to, this is called the Medical Quality Assurance Search Services page for the Department of Health here in Florida. Click on License Verification. And then we're just going to use me as an example. Now you can do things like you can narrow to the board, the 491 board this way if you want to. You don't have to. You can even select your specific license that you're pursuing. Like we'll do licensed mental health counselor. And then we'll just use me as an example. Let's say that you wanted to do your supervision with me and you wanted to make sure I really am a supervisor, even though I say I am. So you would type my name in and then you'd click search. And then you will see Under qualifications, first thing you'll see license status is clear and active. Well, that's good because if my license wasn't clear and active, I surely couldn't be your qualified supervisor. But under qualifications, you will see these two designations, qualified supervisor for mental health counselor interns and for marriage and family therapy interns. So I'm dually qualified for both of those professions to be a qualified supervisor. So you definitely want to make sure that you check this before you agree to do supervision with somebody. So before we move into licensure by endorsement, I'm going to go into our questions here and just see what we have so far. So we have a question from Pamela who is asking, do you usually pay for the supervisor's time? That is an excellent question. So the answer is it depends. If you're working in an agency setting and your agency has a qualified supervisor, then that agency probably is either going to give you free supervision or they will make you sign an agreement that you will work with them for a certain number of years after you're licensed in exchange for free supervision. And then if you do not stay with them for that specified period of time, then you have to pay them a certain rate for all those hours of supervision that you did. So you'll owe them money, basically. That's one scenario, getting supervision within your agency. But in addition to the problems I brought up earlier, there are also scenarios when people are either concerned about the quality of supervision in their agency or they have high turnover. So they end up with a supervisor position that's vacant for a month or two, and then they're not getting their supervision hours, and that becomes pretty messy. So a lot of people will seek a supervisor outside of their agency. In that scenario, you're probably going to be paying for that supervisor. So costs are, most qualified supervisors try to keep their costs pretty reasonable because they know that registered interns often are not getting paid a whole lot of money. So I guess I'll just give you an example in my practice. An individual supervision session, if you're butting up with a second person, is $40. And then if it's a group supervision session, it's $30. So my interns are paying to get weekly supervision. They're paying about $140 a month for their supervision. So that maybe gives you an example, but you'll notice that, for example, Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association, at our local chapter, you can actually see the rates that qualified supervisors charge. So we have a second question here from Dana. You have to get the 1,500 hours towards in no less than 2 years, but can you get them in more than 2 years? The answer to that is yes, you can. That's a great question, but you have a maximum period of time established in the statute, and that maximum is 5 years. So you want to be careful about taking too long because that can create a problem for you as well. So you can take longer, and I've had some interns take 3 years. I've even had some take 4 years, but you definitely don't want to get into that 5th year and put yourself at risk. Natasha says, as a registered mental health counselor intern, can I have an LCSW as a qualified supervisor? I've heard that we can only use LMHC as a supervisor. Great question. There are scenarios where LCSWs are qualified supervisors for MHC interns. But remember that website I just showed you. You'd have to go and make sure that it says qualified supervisor MHC and not just CSW for clinical social worker. There are some social workers who are qualified supervisors for MHCs. You just have to verify that that is the case, that you don't end up with a problem. Martin has a question. Can I receive my degree in marriage and family therapy but be supervised by an LMHC to become an LMHC? So this is actually a little bit of a complicated question in a way. If you have a degree in marriage and family therapy, then the likelihood that you've met the educational requirement to become a registered mental health counselor intern is very low because you probably didn't come from a CACREP-accredited clinical mental health counseling program. And then if your coursework didn't include all 12 of these classes, then you would not have met the educational requirements. But let's assume for a moment that you did get those educational requirements. If that were the case, then even though your degree were an MFT, you could register as a mental health counselor intern and you could get supervised then, or you would have to then be supervised by a qualified supervisor in MHC or mental health counseling. Now, To further complicate matters, let's say that you weren't a registered mental health counselor intern and you were a registered marriage and family therapy intern instead, because you were pursuing a license as a marriage and family therapist, not as a mental health counselor. There are some licensed mental health counselors like myself who are dually licensed, meaning that we have a license in both professions, licensed mental health counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then if you see, like you saw on my page on the Department of Health website, if you see that I'm qualified for both professions, then interns pursuing either license can see me for their supervision. So in that scenario, so I do have interns who are pursuing their license as a marriage and family therapist, not as a mental health counselor, and their hours with me still count because it says I'm qualified as a supervisor for MFT interns. So hopefully that answers your question, Martin. Next question is from Rena. I can do it in less time. You cannot ever do it in less than 100 weeks. That is the minimum period of time to complete your internship towards licensure. And then the next question is from Rena. Psychologists can be qualified supervisors. They hold a PsyD degree. Great question. There are also some psychologists who are qualified supervisors for MHC interns. See, a social worker or a psychologist, to be qualified to do supervision for us, they have to have taken some additional training, but some do have that training, so some do get qualified. But again, you would have to go to their license and you'd have to specifically see that it says qualified MHC. If it doesn't say that, then that psychologist doing supervision with them, my understanding is that will not count towards your licensure. Natasha, okay, thank you. When I looked at my supervisor, it only shows her as a QS, no other specifications. That is very bizarre. I've never seen or heard that before. So what I would suggest in that case, since it doesn't show you what professions the person is a qualified supervisor for, I would contact your licensure board with that question. And a little secret about contacting the 491 board. I have learned that sometimes calling them by phone is very difficult to get through to somebody. You might get in a voicemail, you might never get a call back. I prefer sending an email to them. That way I get the response in writing. So if something went bad down the road, I can show them in writing that they told me that it was okay. And they tend to, I've always gotten a response when I send an email. Sometimes I get it the same day. Sometimes it takes a week or two for me to get an answer, but I always get a response when I do email, and I don't always get that when I make a phone call. So that's what I would recommend for you, Natasha. That's an interesting scenario that I have not heard of yet. And then looks like all we have is a comment after that. So that should take care of our questions for right now anyway, but please keep them coming and I'll check in on the questions in a little bit. So now we'll get to our second path for licensure, which is licensure by endorsement. This is a scenario when you're licensed in another state, but you want to get your license in Florida. So the requirements are that you demonstrate knowledge of the laws and rules here in Florida. And you do that by taking the laws and rules course here in Florida. Second, you have to have had a valid license to practice and have actively practiced as a mental health counselor in another state for 3 of the last 5 years immediately preceding licensure. Third, you have to meet the same education requirements as applicants seeking licensure by examination. So that means either a CACREP-accredited degree or a program that's 60 credit hours with all 12 of those areas, 3 semester hours per 12 areas, per each of those 12 areas, and then your practicum and internship hours as well. And then you have to also have passed the National Clinical Mental Health Counselors exam or an equivalent exam. And recently the 491 board did vote to accept the NCE exam for people who are licensed in other states and are trying to pursue their license here in Florida. So if you're in another state and you met these requirements, but you didn't pass the NCMHCE, but you did pass the NCE exam, then you probably can still get licensed by endorsement here. But finally, you have to hold your license in good standing. So you can't be under investigation for any act that would constitute a violation of our own Florida statute, chapter 491. And you can't have found to have committed an act that would constitute a violation of that statute. But what happens if you are licensed in another state and you don't have a degree from a CACREP accredited program and you and you haven't taken all 12 of these classes. Well, then you would need to take whatever classes you didn't take in your own degree program. But fortunately, you would be eligible for, or could be eligible for, a provisional license, our third path. This is a license that you can have for up to 2 years if you have met the minimum requirements, but you do not have all of the educational requirements. So this will give you 2 years time to start taking any of those classes you saw on the other slide that you haven't taken. So I'll tell you, these are the most common ones that people from other states haven't taken. Sometimes they haven't taken this class, counseling in community settings. And then sometimes I've seen where they haven't taken human sexuality, and I've seen some occasions where they haven't taken a substance abuse course either. I've even heard of one time somebody not having taken a human growth and development course. So those are probably the courses that you're most likely to have not taken in another state. So before we get into licensure portability, which students, even though you may have already gotten the piece on licensure by endorsement, I would pay close attention, because you never know when you might need or want to move to another state. So there's still some valuable information in here for you. But before we get into licensure portability, let's check, because I see a new question. This one is from Dana, who's been offered a job as a clinical case manager. She says her understanding is that when working with clients, I will be both providing therapy and case management. Will those hours count as face-to-face psychotherapy? If you are a registered mental health counselor intern, then the therapy hours that you're doing can count towards your 1,500 hours of psychotherapy. However, this is a great question because people get fuzzy on what hours count and what hours don't. So remember, the board rule says face-to-face psychotherapy. What's psychotherapy? Psychotherapy is basically counseling that's aimed at treating mental distress or mental disorders, or at alleviating serious emotional distress. So if you were just doing case management, where you're meeting with a client and all you're doing is helping them to connect to maybe a community program, for example, in my viewpoint, that's not psychotherapy. So I, as a supervisor, would not feel comfortable with you using an hour of that. But if you were doing evaluation or assessment or treatment planning, or you were doing therapy sessions aimed at helping them to accomplish goals related to their mental health, or you're treating disorders by using therapeutic techniques, all of those hours, crisis intervention hours, all of those kinds of hours, I would personally count as psychotherapy hours. So just because you're meeting with a client doesn't necessarily mean it's psychotherapy, although for most of you, most of your hours will be therapy hours, if not all of them. So Raina says, if I work in a school and I see students and provide individual sessions, does that count? So I'll say the same thing. If that individual session is aimed at treating mental distress, mental disorders, or serious problems related to mental health and wellness, then I would tend to consider that to be psychotherapy. But if it was, oh, let's spend an hour helping you choose your electives, then that certainly does not sound like psychotherapy to me, and I would not be comfortable with hours like that being used towards the psychotherapy requirement. Just to give you an example. Some people have asked, does group therapy count? Yeah, group therapy can count, again, if it is face-to-face and it's psychotherapy. Oh, actually, Tracy has that very question. So there you go, Tracy. We've already answered. Group therapy can count the same as individual psychotherapy. Now, some interns have said, well, if I do a group therapy session with 10 clients, do I get 10 hours? The answer is no. You get 1 hour of therapy if you spent 1 clock hour doing therapy, regardless of the number of clients that you were treating in that hour. So another question about evaluations, risk assessments, and crisis intervention. Yes, I would suggest that those hours, I would personally be comfortable with them as a supervisor, because your evaluation and assessment is an integral part of the psychotherapy process. And in fact, even when you're doing strictly therapy with clients after doing an initial evaluation and treatment planning, you're still doing ongoing assessment as you continue to work with a client and you continue to experience changes and how you conceptualize what's going on with them. It looks like the rest are all comments. So I think we're caught up with questions for now. So let's move into licensure portability then. So licensure portability basically means that if you're licensed in one state, that there's a process that allows you to get licensed in another state. And I'm going to do a quick polling question here. The largest professional association in the United States that exclusively represents clinical mental health counselors is which of the following? A, the American Counseling Association. B, the American Psychotherapy Association. C, the National Board for Certified Counselors. D, the American Mental Health Counselors Association. Or E, CACREP. And I think we can go ahead and close this polling question out for now. Now, the hint here is I've been giving you a hint for the last several seconds here with my coffee mug. So the results are that 38% of you said the American Counseling Association, 6% said CACREP, but 56% said the American Mental Health Counselors Association. So the half of you who answered that AMCA is correct, you are right. So the reason this creates some confusion is the American Counseling Association represents all types of counselors, whether they be career counselors or school counselors or clinical mental health counselors. The American Mental Health Counselors Association was founded in 1976, by the way, co-founded by a counselor here in Florida, who is still very active in our profession, Dr. Jim Messina. But the American Mental Health Counselors Association was originally founded as a division of the ACA that exclusively represents clinical mental health counselors. However, some of you will be finding out soon, there'll be an announcement coming out soon that the American Mental Health Counselors Association has now voted to separate itself from the American Counseling Association. They are now a completely separate entity. So they are the association for clinical mental health counselors. So let's get back then to our slides then on that note. And the reason I asked that question is because there is a plan, a national plan that's been created by several organizations coming together and then hacking out an agreement that they thought states and counselors can pretty much live by. It's called the Joint Statement on a National Counselor Licensure Endorsement Process. So NCLEP is the acronym that we use for this national plan. So who are the people at the table? The National Board for Certified Counselors, or MPCC, was one of them. The American Association of School Counseling Boards, of State Counseling Boards, or AASCB, and they are a division of the ACA, the American Counseling Association. And then there's ACES, the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. So those are your professors and researchers in our field. And then finally, the American Mental Health Counselors Association. The American Counseling Association was involved in the initial stages of developing this plan, but they sort of jumped ship at some point. So these are four major national organizations in our field that have come together and created a process that they are recommending to state legislators. So what does that process look like? Well, basically what they're saying is any counselor who's licensed at the highest level of licensure for independent practice available in his or her state should be able to obtain licensure in any other state or territory of the U.S. if all the following criteria are met. And then they list four criteria. The first three are, number one, the licensee has engaged in ethical practice with no disciplinary sanctions for at least 5 years. Number two, that licensee has possessed the highest level of counselor licensure for independent practice for at least 3 years. Number three, the licensee has completed an exam if required by the state regulatory body. So this would be like your NCMHCE, for example. And then the fourth requirement is that they have to comply with at least one of the four following scenarios. The first is they already meet all the requirements in the state that they're going to. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. Of course, they should get a license in that state then. Number two, this is a typo. The second dash that you see here should be connected to the first dash. But the second scenario is that they hold the NCC credential and good standings issued by the National Board for Certified Counselors. And then number three, they have a graduate level degree from a CACREP-accredited clinical mental health counseling program. So they're saying if you have at least one of these three things, and you've been licensed for at least 5 years, and you have a license in good standing, and you're licensed to practice independently, and you've passed an exam if required by that state, then you should be able to get licensed in that state. So this creates a pathway both for those of us who come from CACREP accredited programs and those of us like myself who don't. So when I saw this plan, the first thing I did was I went out and got my NCC credential because I do not have a CACREP accredited degree. So my thinking was if states start to adopt this plan and I want to move to another state, then I really should get my NCC. And I did it quickly. And the reason why is that the MPCC is going to stop giving NCCs to counselors who do not come from CACREP accredited programs, although that's several years away. I want to say it was maybe 2022 or something, but I could be wrong. And I could provide you with that information as a follow-up question if you like. But so if you are licensed in another state, but you don't have a CACREP accredited degree, and licensure portability is important to you, then I would suggest that you consider getting the NCC credential within the next few years here so that you can maximize your portability going forward. The thing about NCLEP is it doesn't mean anything unless states adopt it. So that's why it's so important for you to get involved with organizations like the American Mental Health Counselors Association and the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, because we're working very hard to help promote licensure portability and to lobby for state licensure boards to adopt legislation. So by the way, Virginia has already passed a plan, from my understanding, that is NCLEP equivalent. And there are several other states right now that have bills that are being introduced that would adopt this licensure portability plan as well. And Florida is one of them. Right now, we have a co-sponsor for a bill that we are drafting that would get us pretty close to the NCLEP standards, if not right on target with it. So I think the writing's on the wall. This is the future of licensure portability. And so it's important, though, to get our state licensure boards on the same page. And the way to do that is to join your association. Your annual membership fee pays the lobbyists and the committees to do the hard work of getting legislation introduced so that you can freely move around from state to state and still practice the profession that you're so enthusiastic and passionate about. So I strongly encourage you, if you're not a member, to become a member and to not just join one level, but all three levels of the American Mental Health Counselors Association, the national, state, and local level, because all three give you really important, all three do really important and integral things on your behalf. And if you're not a member, if we don't have more counselors becoming members, then our voice isn't as strong and our influence isn't as strong, and we can't do as much work to protect your license. So if you do want to join, then one way to do it is you can go to AMCA's website and join, but select unified dues so that you become a dual member of AMCA and PHOMCA at the same time. And then if you're a member of PHOMCA, you can go to the regional association here in the Tampa Bay area. It's the Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association. And I included a link here on the right-hand side that you can use to find your regional chapters. And I know this costs money. It should cost under $250 a year to become a member of all three levels. But it's well worth it. And if you can't afford to do all three, then I would certainly suggest the state and local, if nothing else, and then adding the national when you're maybe generating more income in the future. But it's so critical that we get involved with our associations. Now, before we go into resources, or actually, let me just cover the resources real quick, and then we'll get into our questions, any other questions. So I have AMCA's website here and PHOMCA's website. The 491 board website is floridasmentalhealthprofessions.gov. And if you click on that link and then click resources and then Florida statutes and administrative codes, you'll see that the website does a good job of providing you with all kinds of information on the laws and rules governing our profession. But their website also clearly outlines all the requirements for licensure. So that's a great resource, a very important resource. And then if you want to look up information about NCLEP, here's the link from the American Mental Health Counselors Association that you can visit to find more information about it. Remember, here's the link to access the handouts for today, the slides. It's app.box.com/v/getlicensed. And we'll include this link in the follow-up email that will go to people who complete the evaluation form today. Now, let's get to our remaining questions and answers. So I'm going to click in here and see what we have so far. Raina said, NOVA is not CACREP, but we sit for the CPCE exam. Okay, I guess I'm not familiar with the CPCE exam. I'm familiar with the NCE and the NCMHCE exam. I'm guessing CPCE, maybe it's comps, and that's probably an exam that will help you get your degree, but it's not an exam that will help you get licensed here in Florida. So you'll also need to take the NCMHCE exam. Dana asks, how easy or difficult is it to change supervisors? It should be very easy. When I have an intern that changes, all I do is tell me, and then I send a form called the supervisor attestation form to the board, letting them know that I'm no longer supervising the intern, but documenting all the hours the intern has done with me. And then the new supervisor has to send a letter to the board attesting that they're now agreeing to be the qualified supervisor. It should be very easy as long as the supervisors do their job and do it well. You can even have more than one supervisor at a time. So for example, some interns will see one supervisor for individual supervision and then a second one for group supervision, but they'll have both on file with the board as being qualified supervisors. Let's see here. So Robin says, do registered interns typically get paid? So the answer is yes, typically, in my experience, they almost always are getting paid. All of my 18 interns are getting paid somewhere, either in their agency or they're doing contracted work, self-employed. There are some rules if you want to do private practice work as a registered intern that apply to you that don't apply to agency counselors. I don't personally agree with the rules, but I don't get to make all the rules. So one of the rules is if you do private practice as a registered mental health counselor intern, you must have a licensed mental health professional on the premises when you're meeting with clients. The reason I don't agree with that is it singles out private practice, because if you work in an agency, you can go do in-home therapy with clients and have no supervisor on the premises or no licensed mental health professional, and somehow that's okay just because you're an agency, and I don't understand why they make an exception for private practice. But that's me editorializing, just my opinion. So yeah, occasionally I'll see an intern will do some volunteer work to beef up their hours if they're not getting enough hours, but that's very rare. People are usually getting paid. Dana has asked the question, the supervisor is the one who certifies the hours the intern does of psychotherapy, or is it the site? Is the supervisor. The qualified supervisor must attest, and most supervisors have you keep a log that they sign as you go along, where you're documenting your hours from your setting, and then at the end they're attesting to the number of documented hours. That's how most of us do it. That's the good practice to do it anyway. Then Jeff has a question. What if I don't see my supervisor on the list? She's a clinical psychologist and I've already had her approved through the state, but I still don't see her on the list. So my question is, what list are you talking about? If you're talking about the Florida Department of Health's website, then I would be concerned about that and I would contact the board. I'd send them an email if I were you and say, hey, my supervisor got approved, but when I check her license, I do not see her being listed as a qualified supervisor for MHC interns. I'd send them an email and verify that and do it immediately if it were me. But if you're talking, when you mention lists, if you're talking about PHOMCA's directory or SOMCA's directory, then keep in mind those lists only include members of the association who are qualified supervisors. So there may be many qualified supervisors out there that don't show up on those lists. The next, sorry, let me go back. The next question, the next is just a comment thanking us for the presentation. And wow, man, we're already out of time. It's already 1 o'clock. So my hope is that we've answered all of your questions because I don't see any left in the queue here. So I'm going to go ahead and remind you to complete the webinar evaluation form, which we'll be generating on your screen in just a few moments. Or if you miss it, you'll get a follow-up email in 1 hour. Either way, make sure you do it within the next few hours because we'll be inputting attendance tonight. And we're going to be announcing soon our exciting 2019 webinar series. Remember, student members can attend all of our webinars for free. And your student membership is very cheap with the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association. So I encourage you to register and then take advantage of our free monthly webinars. We've got exciting topics rolling out this year that you can take advantage of. And then with no other questions here, keep in mind that you can email me if you didn't get your question answered. And I'm going to wish you all a very happy and meaningful weekend, and we'll see you next time.